on behalf of the East Bay Community Foundation, our staff and board, I'd like to welcome you to this town hall. I think that the subject title of the town hall is very apropos, the notions of response to transformation, because it really does exhibit the efforts that the East Bay Community Foundation has had over the last few years to really be an institution that not only responds, but also that assists our communities in transformation for the betterment of the residents of those communities. This particular fund and the work that we did during this current pandemic is, I think, very indicative of that. And you will hear much about the journey and the experience we had with the fund, as well as we'll hear from some of our partners who were working on the ground to do this work. One of the unique factors about this that I like to share as I talk about our work and about the fund is that this particular fund actually started with a in-kind and in-house contribution from the foundation of $1 million. Our board of directors felt it important that the foundation clearly identified the need that was out there, as well as our commitment and willingness to contribute and to address that need. Using that $1 million, we actually raised $7.2 million from our donors and from our corporate and foundation partners to be able to give out over $8.2 million to the community. I want to again give a sincere thanks to our donors and to our other partners for their contributions that were critical to our ability to be responsive and to begin to think about transformation in the time that we had. As we all know, this pandemic is still with us and will likely be with us for a fairly significant period of time. What we believe at EBCF is also, though, that the community-based organizations that we've partnered with and have been essential to the work that we've done should continue and need to continue to be with us, to be the trusted messengers, partners, and providers of services in those communities. Much of what we've learned from our experience is that those CBOs are who community residents turn to. While they listen to philanthropic institutions, while they listen to governmental institutions and to private institutions, it is the community-based organizations that truly are able to have them have the trusted information and the messages that will allow them to respond and will allow them to bind together to make a difference in the communities that they serve and to serve the individuals and families who are in need. So that is significant for us, and it's why it's important for us to also showcase those organizations in today's town hall. So with that, I would like to actually introduce Amy Fitzgerald, who's our Vice President of Community Investments and Partnerships at EBCF, to get us going with the program. Amy?
Great. Thanks, James. So Amy Fitzgerald, I'm the Vice President of Community Investment and Partnerships here at EBCF, and I have the honor of supporting the incredible team of people who led the grant-making efforts of the COVID-19 Just East Bay Response Fund. There were several core values that drove our grant-making approach that informed both what we funded and how we channeled the funds. And those were racial equity, trust, humility, and adaptability. These values manifested themselves in the grant-making process in a few different ways. For example, there was no application process to receive grant funds from the COVID-19 Just East Bay Response Fund. Rather, our CIP team researched and identified organizations who are playing critical roles across the region, starting with our existing grantee partners and then extending out beyond that based on our expertise and knowledge of the field, as well as inquiries submitted to EBCF. There were no reporting requirements for grantee recipients. Rather, organizations were invited to complete a brief voluntary survey, and/or our CIP team reached out for periodic check-in calls to understand how organizations were doing and how our grant-making approach needed to evolve and adapt in real time. And finally, we became increasingly explicit over time that our grant-making was to be focused on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, and SWANA-led and serving organizations, because these communities were once again experiencing the disproportionate impacts of concurrent and compounding crises over the last 18 months, including COVID-19, housing instability, unemployment, anti-Blackness and police brutality, anti-Asian racism, threats to our democracy, and climate change. The leadership of these organizations was particularly important to us, given our belief that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, however, often furthest from resources. 18 months ago, the same day we launched the fund, our team started making calls to our core grantee partners to listen and shape our approach. Several things became immediately clear. We needed to prioritize our support towards communities that were going to be the most impacted by this health and economic crisis, and the least likely to receive any support or any kind of public aid. Thus, we directed our support towards undocumented immigrants, unsheltered communities, those employed in the cash economy, such as domestic workers and day laborers, uninsured individuals, seniors, youth, victims of domestic violence, and formerly incarcerated individuals. Grantee partners also made it clear that people needed money immediately. So we moved swiftly to disperse direct financial assistance, through which ultimately became the largest grant-making priority of the fund at just under $2 million. Almost all of those funds were dispersed through community organizing networks or base building organizations who already had deep, long-term relationships with individuals and families, and who were best positioned to understand the economic hardship of their base. We also provided grants to frontline organizations who were providing direct service like medical care, food distribution, and safety net service navigation. Additionally, we provided general operating support to existing grantees and arts and culture organizations to ensure that they had flexible support. As the pandemic worsened, we dedicated additional funding to organizations supporting the unsheltered community and began to support organizations receiving community members released from the prison system, both extremely vulnerable populations with intersecting needs around medical care, housing, and basic services. And throughout our conversations with grantee partners, there was a through line around the growing need for mental health and healing supports to help address the cumulative and collective trauma and stress in the community. EBCF provided just over $1 million to BIPOC-led and serving mental health providers across the region. Additionally, we supported the health and wellness of the employees of our nonprofit partners, many of whom were experiencing stress and trauma in their work of caring for others. One of the unique aspects of the COVID-19 Just East Bay Response Fund was the intentional and significant support for community organizing and systems change alongside direct services. We were clear that both strategies were going to be necessary to address the immediate and long-term impacts of the pandemic. So in the midst of providing critical services to their base, our community organizing partners also mobilized to secure protections for essential workers, early release for incarcerated individuals, rent and eviction moratoriums, equitable vaccine distribution, and have built ongoing campaigns to address the many structural, racial, and economic inequities that have been once again revealed and exacerbated by the pandemic. It's now my honor to turn over the Zoom mic to three incredible leaders who represent the life-sustaining work that our nonprofit partners have been leading prior to the pandemic and through the pandemic into the future. Each of them will share some of their experience and learnings over the last 18 months and what is most important as we look to the future. And you can learn more about their organizations in the chat. First, I'd like to welcome Shakita Redden, the Interim Executive Director of Causa Justa Just Cause. Shakita is a champion of Black and Brown power building and leads Causa Justa Just Cause in their mission to secure housing justice for low-income Oakland and San Francisco residents. Take it away, Shakita.
Thanks, Amy, for that nice introduction. Yeah, so as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic, and our rampant ecological crisis of the wildfires have impacted our livelihoods and well-beings of our folks, both our staff and communities that we serve, which had shifted our original like programmatic goals. And also, right, we're still living through this pandemic and we're in another set of fire seasons, right? And so the nature of COVID has exposed us to the inhumane realities of our movement. And we've been inhumane realities, and our movements have been working to transform all of these aspects that we have worked on for decades, which includes sustainable housing and protections for our immigrant communities and populations. So in 2020, CJC became a powerful resource for tenants and immigrants that have been impacted by COVID-19. And we were able to support recovery efforts through tenant protections, eviction moratoriums, and also expanding our tenant clinic hotline, expanding our hours of like rapid response resources. And it was just an opportunity for us to really fight for community defense and what that means. And initiating a national framework and vision for a cancel rent and cancel debt campaign, which for us is basically like our North Star, which means community rights, community control, community ownership, or what we call community futures is our North Star. And we know that housing is a human right. It's also a public safety issue, and it has been seen as so until, right, it's become a commodity. And at this point, there are so many properties on the speculative market that people are just continually being pushed out. And so what we were able to do during COVID is to be able to, in the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, we were able to reach out to a bunch of our members, hundreds of our members, to do wellness checks, to assess what they need, to share resources with our folks, mental health resources, as well as food, and connected to mutual aid support with Bay Resistance, which is, we're a founding partner of that organization. And so we were able to just make sure our folks were good, and also if they needed help them through the process of applying for unemployment. We were also able to, we know that like through COVID and folks being at home, that we recognize that there was a digital divide. And so we've been able to also give out tablets to our folks, and have paid for 2 years of these tablets and like the services to make sure that they have access to their families, make sure that they actually have access to like the internet. Like it's a lifeline, and lots of folks do not necessarily have access to that. And so making sure that our folks have access to their needs through resources of the internet. We also were able to last year provide like air purifiers for folks through the wildfires. And so just to go in a little bit further, in terms of us expanding our tenant hotlines, we were able to shift and get more volunteers and counselors to support the work of like folks who were calling because landlords harassment. And so we've been able to build up and scale up that capacity. And also last year, we worked really, really diligently and hard with our partners, with Council Member Nikki Bass and other community partners, to really make sure that we pass the eviction moratorium in Oakland. We also did it in San Francisco too, because we're a regional organization, but passed one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the country, actually. And so we know that millions of folks are in debt due to rent, but also other forms of debt. And in Alameda County is like, the sixth ranked county in California in terms of debt, like at a whopping $206 million of folks who owe all forms of debt. And things that we're thinking about, right, are how do we continue to protect our folks and continue tenant protections. We've been able to upgrade that this year to upgrade the ordinances that were passed in 2016. And I think what we're looking for not forward to, but what we're thinking about as we move forward is that the statewide eviction moratorium was pushed until the end of this month. The end of next month. And so what happens for our folks when that's up, right? Like what happens when folks are actually kicked out, and what happens like right to the eviction, what we're calling the eviction tsunami. And so one thing that we've been able to do as of right now is we've been able to start a website, a tenant protection website that folks can go on to actually really get to know their rights, to understand the rights around harassment, lack of repairs. And it's not something that we launched directly last year, but it's launching actually next month. And we're very excited about it. And we think that it will help with some of the protections around the eviction tsunami. And lastly, I think a big thing that we need to continue to think about is that I think our elected officials in very many ways have used this pandemic to be elected, to say that they have the answer for COVID, and we actually haven't really seen that. And so I think things that I'm continually thinking about and that we will continually work on is, one, obviously making sure our folks stay housed. Two, right, the connections and intersections between housing and criminalization, right, and the role that the militarization of our folks play into housing and evictions. And three, one thing that I am also constantly worried about that isn't necessarily just from an organizing framework, but the fact that like we're moving on, like we're okay and we're not. Right, we saw last year essential workers were back to work, and they're still there now. Like, right, 60% of essential workers are BIPOC folks, and usually out of single parent households, right? And so what does that mean? Like sending our kids back to school, what does that mean for folks being dually exposed? What does that mean for our folks who are not vaccinated? And so I don't have all of the answers. I don't think any of us have all the answers, but those are just the things that I'm sitting with. So
thank you. Thank you, Shakita. I really appreciate what you've shared, and particularly how you've really highlighted an incredibly comprehensive response that Causa Justa Just Cause had in terms of supporting your base and your members, as well as kind of this also mobilizing and organizing folks around long-term pieces around the rent and credit moratoriums, debt moratoriums, and I think this image of an eviction tsunami is going to sit with all of us and really is a very stark reminder of the future of what's coming for a lot of our folks. So thank you. I'm going to move us and next introduce Deborah Ballinger, the Executive Director of Monument Impact in Concord. Deborah is a lifelong organizer and deeply committed to immigrant rights. Deborah and the team at Monument Impact provide critical services to the Latinx community in Contra Costa, while simultaneously building and exercise power for systems change. So welcome, Deborah, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks so much for having me. As you all know, COVID-19 hit communities of color the hardest, and especially the Latinx community. We saw people lose their jobs almost instantly, from our day laborers to members who worked in restaurants to to those who suddenly had their children at home doing online learning. The shutdown was really devastating. As a 20-year-old organization that has worked hard to build trust and relationships in the immigrant and refugee community, we lift up immigrant rights, housing justice, and economic inclusion. But we had to really assess how to maintain relationships with our community in this new environment. Staff immediately started calling and texting program participants to see how they were doing and to get a sense of what they needed. It became instantly clear people needed food and financial assistance. So our first response was to start the Monument Relief Fund, which was actually seeded with a $23,000 grant from the East Bay Community Foundation's COVID-19 Adjust East Bay Response Fund. That grant leveraged the generosity of many individual donors and other foundations that learned we needed funds to support undocumented families. So what started as a modest drive to raise $60,000 morphed into a $2 million fund that has provided direct assistance to 3,200 undocumented families. One community member we assisted was Manuel Caballero. When Manuel lost his job, the fund helped him pay for food and rent. Then his landlord found a legal way to evict him, his wife, and his 4 children on April 30th of this year. Finding a place to house his family of 6 only on his Uber income was challenging. But when he did, our Monument Relief Fund came forward to cover his first and last month's rent. We actually pivoted all of our programs to online formats. But our immigrant community in Central and East Contra Costa faces a significant digital divide. Yet staff met this challenge with tremendous creativity. We loaned out computers. We did one-on-one tutorials on how to use a computer and a mouse. We helped people access Zoom on their phones, tablets, and computers. We partnered with the Pittsburgh Unified School District to teach parents how to use Chromebooks so they could help their children with their remote learning. In fact, over 150 parents went through those classes and have now enrolled in our technology program. We added QuickBooks to our technology curriculum because community members asked for it. Our mental health program was also redesigned to be offered online, and it was fully enrolled. The isolation of shelter in place, the fear of losing homes because people couldn't make rent, and the personal sacrifices families made to ensure their children had enough to eat put an untold amount of stress on families. We directed community members to where they could access food and healthcare, especially as we learned of more people getting sick and having to quarantine. And working with our allies, we won Eviction Moratorium first in Concord, then in Antioch, Pittsburgh, San Pablo, and the county. Contra Costa has the second highest number of families at risk of evictions in the Bay Area and the second highest amount of evictions in the Bay Area. But our community organizers created a how-to manual called Help, I Can't Pay the Rent, to assist the community members in communicating with their landlords and navigating state and local moratorium laws. Over 11,000 people accessed this guide online. We co-host tenant legal clinics and help tenants address egregious violations of the moratorium and increased landlord harassment. Lucina Ayala and her husband are both in their late 60s. They've always paid their rent on time, and even during COVID did not miss a payment. But their landlord repeatedly entered their apartment without notice, told them how they should clean it, and refused to fix their refrigerator and stove. They were forced to buy prepared meals they couldn't afford, and when they finally bought a used stove, their landlord made them remove it. We helped Lucina get her apartment inspected by the city, and the landlord was forced to pay them back for the stove. But when he illegally raised their rent in February and tried to evict them, we scheduled Lucina for one of our tenants' legal clinics, and the attorney wrote a letter to the landlord about his multiple violations of state law. So our staff helped prevent this couple from becoming homeless for now. This fall, to amplify our housing justice work, we're excited to launch our first arts and culture program next month. Called Homes, or Home Offers Me Escape and Safety, the program is designed for local youth to be civically engaged through artistic expression. Over the course of several months, participants in the program will use storytelling to draw from the personal impact of the pandemic and housing crisis on the safe places they look to for a home. The program will culminate next year with a performance. So as we all work towards a just recovery, Monument Impact can help people build their job skills, access healthcare, promote vaccines. Our community-based health promoters have actually reached well over 20,000 residents in East and Central Contra Costa about the importance of being vaccinated. We can expand our mental health program and help people apply for rental assistance. But we all know there is an eviction cliff on the other side of the state's moratorium. Like Shakita said, it's going to expire September 30th. Recovery means we must put people's health first, but the COVID risk for low-income communities of color will dramatically increase if they are unhoused. We must continue to get economic relief directly to the people most impacted by COVID, and we must ensure people have safe places to live. A just recovery also means we have to prioritize equity in helping workers and communities to increase economic stability and mobility, and to create resilience for future crises. Above all, we must shift power and listen to those most impacted by the systems that marginalize rather than lift up. Our BIPOC community members' lived experiences can and must root future change. Thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about our COVID work, but mostly thank you for your support. It has made such a difference to our immigrant and refugee communities.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing the stories of your community partners in Contra Costa and in Concord. Quite often stories like that don't get shared broadly, and particularly around Contra Costa. It's particularly an area that our Bay Area news doesn't really cover. So your insight is incredibly important. Finally, it's my honor to introduce Kimberly Aceves Iniguez, co-founder and executive director of Rise Center in Richmond. For more than 20 years, Kimberly has developed and supported hundreds of youth leaders who are making change across California and across the country. Kimberly's thoughtful leadership of Rise Center has created a safe and inclusive space for BIPOC youth where their health, education, creativity, and power are centered and supported. Welcome, Kimberly. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody. I think I want to start by really appreciating the other leaders on this call. It has been a difficult time, an unprecedented time to try to lead, and just really wanting to humanize that. I know that everyone is holding a lot and has been holding a lot over the last year and a half. So I want to share a little bit about how Rise approached the last, it feels like forever, but the last year and some change. I often tell people our approach to the pandemic really started in October 2008, when after 6 years of youth organizing, after power building and relationship building in a community that had been historically disinvested, the Rise Center opened our doors in Richmond with two primary goals. One of the goals was to transform systems to ensure that those most proximate, BIPOC young people, queer young people, unhoused young people, immigrant youth were the drivers of the strategies that centered their lived experiences and what they needed and wanted for their community. And then secondly, when we opened our doors, it was critical that one of our key goals was to ensure young people feel listened to by their peers and adults, that they feel loved by their peers and adults, and they feel powerful. For Rise at the time and since then, it's absolutely meant centering and building trusting relationships with young people, with their families, with our partners. And over the years, really critical that those relationships not only help us navigate atmospheric trauma, but actually have been helping us really navigate towards atmospheric healing, atmospheric joy. And young people really need getting and receiving what they need and what they deserve. Fast forward 12 years later in March 2020, just as we began to break ground on a new youth design campus that young people had really been dreaming to expand our impact, Rise had to close our physical space and move everything virtually. And as we pivoted into what I know everybody has experienced as super uncharted waters and a lot of not sure what the hell was going to happen, there were two primary things that we relied on: transforming systems and ensuring that those most proximate to the drivers of strategy and COVID response, our BIPOC young people, were at the table, making their voices central in what we create for them and for their experience. And two, to ensure young people feel listened to, young people feel loved, and that they feel powerful in a situation that honestly has been quite devastating. And many young people sort of felt immediately disempowered by what was happening to them as they were trying to also navigate the pandemic with a lot of uncertainty. So what we started Rise with is what we continued to rely on as our North Stars, and how we decided to make the decisions we did in partnership with our young people, in partnership with our families, to really respond to the climate crisis, the pandemic crisis, the racial injustices that we know have been going on for centuries prior. But those tenets were really important for how we led and how we moved. And so what that meant for us was our strategies had to be liberation focused and values aligned. And some of what that looked like meant that most immediately, Rise made a decision to resist going inward and taking care of the small us, Rise, and understanding that there was really a need to respond to the big us, our larger community, and that our pivots, we had to trust ourselves that relationships were going to be critical. Our commitment to relationships, we had to really lead with. And that had everything to do with our organization's deep commitment to organizing and power building, right? We had to stay true to that mission, despite the fear of what's going to happen to our organization, because we were all afraid. We had no idea what was going to happen. So we had to rely on what we know best. We immediately halted our capital campaign, which at the time felt irrelevant because we had to focus on emerging community response and resource distribution. So we made a decision organizationally that we have to focus in because we could see how our community was going to be sort of increased challenges they were going to be experiencing. So, we quickly built an infrastructure and want to appreciate places like the East Bay Community Foundation that gave us that freedom to really move fast in the way we needed to. We built an infrastructure to be able to distribute resources to over 400 young people and their families through our Youth COVID Response Fund. We supported young people in finding housing, paying bills, COVID supplies. Really, because we had relationships, we could access young people quickly, even if we weren't in a building. We purchased hotspots, iPads, computers for young people so they could participate in telehealth, programming, and even engage in school. During this time, we worked with key partners, and I actually looked at the list of who's on the call, and some of them are here to support the launch of the Richmond Rapid Response Fund, which I think is super powerful because it's grounded in values of liberation and equity and relationships. And really, I think what the Richmond Rapid Response Fund is something that really demonstrates that it's not individual failure, that people weren't ready for this. It was a system failure. And that really, in the way that was constructed, was about partnerships, relationships, and really love towards our community. Rise launched the West County Care Calls. So again, rather than going inward and figuring out what was going to work for us, we quickly created a countywide humanizing space where young people, their voices were centered, BIPOC voices were centered, art and healing was centered, and systems partners and community members could really come together to coordinate response, right? We were all navigating this. This is new. None of us knew. And so we had to sort of create vulnerable space to say, what do we do? Like, what are other people doing? And again, we couldn't have done that if we didn't have relationships. I think it's important for folks to know that even though there was a pandemic, our young people were still dealing with lethal violence that we were responding to, We saw an explosive need for mental health services. As over the past years, we saw wins and policy wins that our young people fought for starting to become dismantled as some leaders took advantage of this moment. So, you know, it was really like, how do we tend to all of that while we're tending to this new reality? We insisted that art and culture remain a critical part of our young people's experience and healing and joy. So we were getting art packs out to young people's homes because their mental health needed it. You know, and again, I think a big piece of this, we tended to our staff, and really that sort of healing our healers model, it really had to happen. This has been a relentless time for our staff. We've had a clinical director pass away. We've lost members to gun violence. We've had houses ravaged by COVID. And as our staff are tending to our members, we're also tending to our kids, right, during this time. So we are not outside of this. None of us are outside of it. So, you know, I mean, those are just some of the things that RISE really did to think about, like, how do we address this moment? You know, I think we made a lot of mistakes. That one of the things RISE says is we're going to make mistakes, we're going to learn from them, and then we're going to share our learning. So we also tried to be very transparent, and wherever we could, if we learned something, we're like, here, take it, because it worked for us, maybe it'll work for you. And then finally, before I know I'm gonna have to wrap up, but sort of what's next for us, more grant making, like EBCS, really centering relationships and trust, prioritizing mental health, universal basic income for young folks who are really marginalized. Please, 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 in these moments, recognize joy, art, and creativity have to have a central home and response dollars towards community healing. And in a perfect world, I would say we start to bolster up, as a Bay Area, more of a justice response network. So should this happen again, we feel a little bit more prepared, not just in our own sort of part of the community, but as a larger Bay Area community.
I want to thank the community partners you just heard from. And by the way, my name is Alexandra Aquino Fike. I'm the Vice President of Development here at the East Bay Community Foundation. But again, I want to thank Shakita, Deborah, Kimberly, and the organizations they represent, Causa Justa Just Cause, Monument Impact, and the RISE Center. I know how precious your time is as you and your staff work tirelessly to defend those most vulnerable in our communities and to build power. Thank you for sharing stories and information from the front lines that inform what we've all been hearing about in the news, from the upcoming eviction tsunami, the ongoing crippling debt in our communities, food insecurity, a mental health crisis, especially for our young people, crises that have historically and continue to impact people of color disproportionately. We at the East Bay Community Foundation are poised and have been poised to do this work, building with community partners like Causa Justa, Monument Impact, and the RISE Center, and many others, leaning into the leadership and the relationships of these community organizations that have been working on the front lines to build power among communities most impacted by institutional racism and structural barriers to opportunity. We are answering the call of this moment and asking others like you, our trusted partners, our donors, who want to stand with us to come together in support of a powerful grassroots movement in the East Bay. We all understand that these challenges are bigger socioeconomic and racial injustice challenges that are historical and ongoing. And our COVID-19 Response Fund thus leaned into these learnings and these values and is now evolving into a permanent community fund, what we're calling a Just East Bay Fund. This fund is really about taking what we did with the COVID-19 Response Fund and going deeper. With this fund, we're going to raise much needed resources and capital to support social movements and that are working on creating deep systems change, empowering local leaders and their communities, those communities most adversely affected by social injustice in our counties. And that means for us an intentional focus on BIPOC communities. This year, we have set an ambitious goal of raising $5 million for our local communities. This vision of a Just East Bay and the fund centers around four core strategies, which you may have heard about before. First, community organizing, power building, and movement building. Second, fostering new inclusive economic models. Third, capacity building for racial equity. Fourth, supporting cultural strategies for social and racial justice. You may have heard of the numerous initiatives the East Bay Community Foundation has launched over the past 5 years in furtherance of these strategies, such as our Ascend BLO initiative, our Inclusive Economy Initiative, and the Real People's Fund, our recent Belonging in Oakland, a Just City Cultural Fund, and our long-term East Bay Fund for Artists. These are just a few of the groundbreaking and innovative initiatives that the East Bay Community Foundation has launched in furtherance of movement building and really building power for those most adversely affected by long-term systems inequities. Building a just East Bay requires transforming our power structures to promote equity. And really, you've heard these moving stories from Shakita, Deborah, and Kimberly on how reimagining and rebuilding our society is not only possible, but I would argue necessary for our collective healing, growth, and our long-term survival. I invite each of you to join us by challenging yourself, your family, your friends, your foundation, to go way beyond your comfort zone and examine your own power, your privilege, but also your capacity to do more and to give more. EBCF is here to support all of you to engage in deep learning and transformative philanthropy. And a first step for all of us is to invest big in this much needed community fund. I'm confident that we can not only meet our goal of 5 million in this first year, but blow it out of the water. And now I'd like to share a message from our esteemed board member, Connie Kagangpang Heller, who will speak about the importance of listening to the stories and lived experiences of community leaders like Shakita, Deborah, and Kimberly, and the power of a collective community fund. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Connie Kagampong Heller, and I am a donor to the East Bay Community Foundation, and I'm also a member of the board. I fairly early on realized that where I wanted to be working was on structural change and particularly on racial equity. In looking at the field, I realized that so many of the problems that I saw in the world really we needed to try to get to them at their root cause. And so it became really important to support base building and community organizing so that communities are able to share their stories and to build power. And the sharing of stories becomes really important because when we hear people's stories, it helps us to understand how we make sense of the world. I have been able to find intermediaries such as Just East Bay that I share values and strategy with. So I know that my donations are supporting the kinds of work I would want to support. And so then by doing that, not only do I have a reach to organizations that I would not necessarily or easily know about, those organizations are in relationship with each other. And then they're also in relationship with a funder who's able to then help them get access to an even wider range of support and resources, capacity building, and that kind of thing. And then, of course, I also get the experience of feeling like I belong to a community and that I'm doing my part. It helps make philanthropy more interesting and more engaging, and I'm able to play my role better without inhibiting the work or confusing my ideas with the work that that grantees want to be doing. So to others who are considering donating to a Just East Bay fund, I would say that the Bay Area needs us, all of us, and each of us doing our own part. Giving our donations collectively really does amplify our impact. The East Bay Community Foundation is one of the most innovative community foundations in the country, and really is becoming a national leader, or is a national leader, and I think is on the cusp of even taking that position more strongly. I trust East Bay Community Foundation because of the people. and the commitment of everybody's involved with it.
So hi, this is James Head again. I want to first thank Connie for her words and also for her sort of trust in East Bay Community Foundation. Also, as want to echo Alex's sentiment with a thank you to Sarita, to Deborah and Kimberly, as well as I know on this call there are lots of community-based organization representatives, and I want to acknowledge the work that you do, both domestically and internationally. Before going to question and answers, I do want to again reemphasize both Connie and Alex's request for those of you who are donors, who are institutional partners with us, funders and others, really would love to continue to have your support and have you stand with us in putting this fund forward. It's a great opportunity to continue this work, not just in the context of an ongoing pandemic, but to actually get to the transformation that we have talked about and that we all, I think, see as the North Star for where we're trying to go. So with that, hope that you will join us in that effort. And I will now turn it over to Brenda, and hopefully we can have time for a few interchanges around questions and answers. Brenda?
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for this inspiring conversation and thought-provoking remarks. We do have just a few questions, and I'm going to pose the first one to our three community partners and ask that they each speak a minute or two on this question. And it's a question about, in terms of community stabilization and recovery, how should investments be driven now to support sustainable and strategic impact? What are the midterm and long-term needs to preserve low-income, affordable, and community-owned land? And if you each have something to comment on that, that would be great. Let's start with Shakita.
Thanks for that question. And I think in terms of community stabilization, right, like our communities know what we need to, one, be safe, and also in terms of housing. I think a lot of the work, a big part of the work that we are focusing on right now is called TOPA, which is the Tenant Opportunities to Purchase Act, which takes housing off of the speculative market and gives tenants the opportunity to buy. And actually the name, it's a very long name, it's Moms for Housing Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, right? And really just sprung up following, we saw the moms take over housing. So I think that's a big part to actually like stabilizing, is taking homes off of the speculative market. And a big part of that is we're working with the Oakland Land Trust. And so I think resources can always be funneled into there. And also that coalition, it's a large coalition that we're working with to make sure and ensuring that folks stay housed. So I think that's a big aspect of it.
Thank you, Shakita. Deb, do you want to address this question next?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what has to happen through the midterm is that we need to stabilize housing. You know, it's just a fundamental, well, we've talked about it being as a human right, but it's really fundamental to, number one, keeping families safe, keeping them safe from actually getting the Delta variant. If you don't have a home, you can't stay safe. And that there are many ways of looking at that. I mean, one that we're doing is really a whole lot of advocacy around increasing legal protections in Contra Costa County so that people have access to an attorney if they receive an unlawful detainer or an eviction notice. We are advocating for attorneys to be present at the courthouse when eviction hearings happen. And we're kind of doing that both in Contra Costa, but we're also sort of working at this through the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority as well. We also we don't have a CLT in Central or East Contra Costa, but we're holding a forum next month in partnership with Richmond Land to look at how do we build either maybe a county-wide CLT, something that will actually address what Shakita was talking about in terms of getting land off the speculative market. There's also public land in Concord and in other places in the county that should be used for public good. So those are just some of the things that we're working on right now.
Thank you so much, Deb. Kimberly, do you want to add to this?
Sure. I think what feels important to note is that for so many of our organizations, our vision and strategies that we've been sort of sharing for decades, it seems like if those were invested in and actually resources were put into the places we've indicated in the past, I actually think we would have been more prepared for this, right? Because we've been talking about basic income, basic needs being met, renting, housing stability. This is a conversation that we've been having sort of prior to the pandemic. So one of the things I would say is definitely, as folks are giving resources, give to the groups that have been talking about dismantling white supremacy, interrupting sort of inequities, centering racial justice, because we've been talking about what we've been needing forever. So that's one thing I'm just going to preach that is, and sometimes it's frustrating because it's like, wow, what is needed is what we've been saying. And I do think being able for us, especially working with young people, sort of flexible resources to sort of match this moment. Like, we don't know what young people are needing at any given time. And, we couldn't have predicted the extreme need for mental health services, right? So that is, right. So how do we allow resources for organizations to put the money where we know it's going to be best needed? Because what we've learned about the pandemic too is sometimes things are changing quickly. The environment's changing quickly. So I'm still about short term. We need more mental health resource dollars. We need basic needs supports. We need young people to have some sort of basic income because they're navigating a lot and they don't have what they need. And then keep funding the groups that are centering racial justice, right? That's a big one.
Thank you, Kimberly. I really appreciate all three of you answering that question. And I think we have time for just one more quick question about how do you all think about the balance between investing resources into immediate needs, such as providing housing stipends and eviction prevention policies, with even more systemic justice efforts, such as policies to ensure that working people earn living wages and have adequate unemployment insurance so they can afford housing. And any one of the panelists, if you want to unmute and jump in, we just have a few more minutes, and I appreciate that question. Thank you, Belinda.
For the community that Monument Impact serves, which is probably 50% undocumented, living wage takes on kind of a new level of importance because it's not going to happen through any state or federal benefits. So for us, it's investing in small family-owned businesses, which is something that we've been doing in Concord, and we want to expand to East Contra Costa. Because that's how folks can make a living wage for their family, is to own their own business. And it is a way that undocumented immigrants do make ends meet and get their kids into college, for example.
Yeah, thanks for this question as well. I think, well, I know, right, a big part of what we're talking about, as Kimberly lifted up multiple times, right, is liberation. And what does liberation look like? And right, to be able to do that, we also have to be able to make sure our folks' basic needs are met. And so, right, we're constantly looking at the long-term trajectory and what it means to get to liberation, while also sometimes we have to two-step and pivot and what comes up for us. You know, and a model that we work from is the Panthers model of services, direct services that actually impact in base building. And so the serve the people model, which, right, is that we're organizing for long-term sustainable change and liberation while simultaneously being able to help support and meet people's needs. And I think that's what this moment is calling for and what we continually need to do, and hopefully continue to be resourced in order to be able to do that.
Thank you, Shakita. Kimberly, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I just want to echo what Shakita said. Thank you for that. I mean, you know, I will just note that, you know, a decade ago, you know, having done work in the youth organizing field for many decades now, one of the things that we had always shared is that in order to do this right, we have to look at direct service, basic needs to systems change. It's very difficult for some funders and donors to understand that it was all about sort of the win and the policy win. And what we kept saying is if we don't care for our young folks, they are not going to live long enough to experience the win that they've actually been fighting for. So I will echo that. Direct service, base building, systems change. That is the path forward. It's not one or the other, for sure.
Thank you, Kimberly. I am sorry to those of you who asked questions that we couldn't get to. We will try to respond via email in the days that follow. I want to bring Amy Fitzgerald back to the screen just to close this out. Thanks, everyone.
Great. It's just my pleasure to give our final thanks, especially to Kimberly, Shakita, and Deborah, who joined us today and shared their insight and brilliance. And to everyone who joined us on the webinar. Many of you were actual grantee partners of the COVID-19 Just East Bay Fund. And I want to echo something that Kimberly lifted up early in her comments about how difficult it is and was to lead over the last 18, always difficult, and especially in really turbulent and unpredictable times. So thank you to each one of you. And just, you know, I think in light of the last question and how it relates to the Just East Bay Fund, I think, you know, the best people to navigate that continuum of direct services to systems change are exactly the folks who have spoken today and many of the folks who are on this call. And for those of us who are aspiring to be allies in that movement and to be resource mobilizers to that movement, I think our call is to listen, provide flexible resources, and trust the leadership and the brilliance and the direction of communities who are leading every single day. And so many of the examples that were given to us today about how these organizations think of that work. Finally, I just want to invite you to read the COVID-19 Just East Bay Response Fund. Support the work of our community partners when folks put out the call to action to support things like preventing the eviction tsunami and the debt crisis. And reach out to our EBCF team to learn more about the Just East Bay Fund and the type of strategies and funding we are hoping to raise and support towards our community goals. For now, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this hour with us, and we really look forward to engaging with you more around the Just East Bay Fund and our resource mobilization to incredible organizations in the East Bay. Thank you for joining. Have a great day.